What would you do if 3 men in suits dragged you from your wedding preparation room and shaved your head completely bald just hours before walking down the aisle? Sarah Mitchell was living every woman's dream that October morning, getting ready in the presidential suite of a luxury mountain resort, her $8,000 Italian silk dress hanging perfectly, her hair styled in an elegant updo that had taken 2 hours to perfect. 300 guests waited in the chapel below, including Fortune 500 executives who could launch her event planning company into the big leagues. Her disabled veteran brother Tommy was finally getting the PTSD treatment he needed thanks to her success, and her tech entrepreneur fiancé Jake was about to become her husband in what she'd planned as the wedding of the century. Then came the knock on the door. 3 men in dark suits with earpieces, claiming to be resort security. "Bomb threat," they said calmly. "We need to evacuate you immediately for your safety." It sounded logical. Sarah followed them through service corridors she'd never seen before, down concrete stairwells that smelled like industrial cleaning supplies, trusting these professional-looking men who said they were protecting her. The basement utility room looked nothing like a safe evacuation area. Bare concrete walls, exposed pipes, harsh fluorescent lighting. Before Sarah could ask questions, they forced her into a metal chair and one man pulled out electric hair clippers. "No, please," she screamed, but 3 trained men held down one woman in a wedding dress. They shaved off every strand of her beautiful hair while recording it on a phone, turning her wedding day into a live-streamed humiliation. 2 hours later, Sarah walked down that mountain chapel aisle completely bald, her scalp shining under the lights, while 300 guests sat in horrified silence. Her fiancé Jake backed away from the altar in shock, unable to process what he was seeing. But why would billionaire CEO Richard Blackstone order such a brutal attack on his own employee's wedding day? 8 months earlier, Sarah Mitchell had walked into Blackstone Mountain Resort's executive boardroom wearing her best business suit, carrying a portfolio that represented 3 years of building her event planning company from nothing. She was 27 then, hungry and determined, with a disabled veteran brother depending on her success. The luxury resort chain was exactly the kind of client that could transform her small Colorado Springs business into something that mattered, something that could finally cover Tommy's medical bills and give them both a real future. Richard Blackstone had been 51 then, silver-haired and sharp-suited, worth an estimated $400 million from his luxury resort empire spanning 12 states. He'd built his first hotel at 35 with money inherited from his oil executive father, then spent 16 years convincing everyone he was a self-made man. Sarah had researched him thoroughly. Successful CEOs appreciate preparation, and landing Blackstone's corporate events would mean steady 6-figure contracts. What she hadn't researched was his reputation with female employees, the whispered stories about the assistants who'd left suddenly, the settlement agreements that came with non-disclosure clauses. The first meeting had gone perfectly. Sarah's presentation on corporate retreat planning had impressed the entire executive team, and Blackstone himself had seemed genuinely interested in her military family background. Tommy had been wounded in Afghanistan 3 years earlier, an IED explosion that had left him with traumatic brain injury and PTSD so severe he couldn't work. Sarah supported them both while Tommy attended private therapy sessions that cost $2,400 monthly, sessions the VA couldn't provide, but that were slowly bringing her brother back from complete despair. Blackstone had offered her a 6-month contract on the spot, planning corporate events for Fortune 500 companies that rented his mountain properties. The money would be enough to keep Tommy in therapy and maybe even save for her own wedding. She'd been dating Jake Thompson for 2 years, watching his tech startup slowly gain traction in the competitive app development world. Jake had created a logistics platform for small businesses that was finally attracting serious investor attention. Between his growing success and her new corporate clients, they were planning their future together. The problem started in month 2. Blackstone began requesting private meetings to discuss event details. Meetings that stretched longer than necessary and always ended with personal questions about her relationship status. He'd touch her shoulder when reviewing contracts, stand too close when examining venue layouts, make comments about how beautiful she looked in business attire. Sarah had handled workplace creeps before. The service industry was full of them. But Blackstone was different. He owned everything. The resort where she worked, the venues where she planned events, the network of corporate clients who could make or break her company. When she mentioned her engagement to Jake during month 3, Blackstone's demeanor shifted noticeably. He'd started calling Jake, "your little tech boyfriend," and questioning whether a startup entrepreneur could really provide the stability Sarah deserved. He began assigning her to work weekend events, scheduling Monday morning meetings that conflicted with Tommy's therapy appointments, finding excuses to extend her contract deadlines. Sarah realized he was testing her priorities, seeing how much control he could exert over her schedule and her life. The wedding planning had made everything worse. Sarah had chosen Blackstone's flagship mountain resort for her ceremony, partly because her employee discount made it affordable, but mostly because hosting her wedding there would showcase her event planning skills to every corporate client attending. She'd invited 300 guests, including executives from companies that could provide years of future business. The wedding was scheduled for a peak fall season, when the Colorado mountains were perfectly golden and Instagram-worthy. Everything was planned to perfection. But Blackstone watched her plan every detail with growing fury. Here was this woman, this employee who worked in his building and owed her success to his company, planning to marry some nobody tech entrepreneur instead of appreciating the attention of a real billionaire. He'd started making increasingly aggressive comments about Jake during their planning meetings, questioning his financial stability, suggesting Sarah was settling for someone beneath her potential. When she firmly told him her personal life was off limits, Blackstone had smiled coldly and said successful people never limited their options. The breaking point came 6 weeks before the wedding. Sarah had been working late in her office, finalizing seating charts for her ceremony, when Blackstone appeared in her doorway. He'd been drinking, she could smell the expensive scotch, and he'd made his intentions crystal clear. He wanted her. He'd always gotten what he wanted, and he couldn't understand why she was choosing poverty with Jake over luxury with him. When Sarah firmly rejected him and threatened to report his behavior, Blackstone had laughed. Report him to whom? He owned the company, employed half the town, and had lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. That night, Sarah realized she was trapped in a game where Blackstone controlled all the pieces, and her wedding day was approaching like a deadline she couldn't escape. But she had no idea how far a billionaire's wounded ego would drive him to destroy everything she'd built. Sarah's entire future was riding on October 15th, 2025. She'd calculated every detail, invested every dollar she could scrape together, and leveraged every relationship she'd built over 3 years of growing her event planning company. This wasn't just her wedding day. It was the single most important business opportunity of her life, and she knew it might be her only shot at breaking into the luxury corporate event market that could finally secure Tommy's medical future. The numbers were staggering, even by her ambitious standards. Sarah had spent $35,000 of her own money on the wedding, money she'd saved by eating ramen dinners and driving a 10-year-old Honda while competitors were leasing BMWs. But this wasn't about showing off. Every penny was a calculated investment. The floral arrangements alone cost $8,000, designed to showcase her ability to coordinate with Colorado's most exclusive vendors. The photography package ran $12,000, but the photographer also shot events for Microsoft and Apple executives who would be attending as Jake's potential investors. 300 guests would witness what Sarah was calling the Mitchell wedding experience, and she'd carefully curated that guest list like a Fortune 500 networking event. Jake's tech startup connections included venture capitalists from Denver and Silicon Valley, men and women who regularly planned corporate retreats worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sarah's existing clients from her previous corporate events would see her personal style translated into wedding elegance, proving she could handle any scale of luxury planning. Most importantly, executives from 6 major companies that Blackstone's resort chain courted for annual conferences would be watching her orchestrate every detail. The venue itself was Sarah's masterstroke. Blackstone's flagship mountain resort typically charged $50,000 for October wedding packages, but her employee discount brought it down to $18,000. Still her largest single expense, but worth every penny for the showcase opportunity. The resort's autumn setting was Instagram perfection, with golden aspens framing the mountain chapel and the reception ballroom overlooking Colorado's dramatic peaks. Corporate clients planning executive retreats or product launches would see exactly what kind of elevated experiences Sarah could create for their events. She'd designed the wedding timeline like a corporate event, with strategic moments planned to impress different guest segments. The cocktail hour would feature locally sourced cuisine prepared by the resort's award-winning chef, demonstrating her relationships with high-end catering teams. The reception would include live music from a Denver symphony quartet that also performed at corporate galas, showing her access to entertainment that typical event planners couldn't book. Even the late-night after-party was designed to showcase her ability to manage complex logistics, with transportation coordination for guests staying at 3 different resort properties. Tommy's medical situation added desperate urgency to Sarah's business calculations. His PTSD therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez, the only specialist who'd shown real progress with his case, cost $2,400 monthly and weren't covered by VA benefits. Sarah had been paying those bills for 18 months, watching her brother slowly recover from the severe depression that had consumed him after his medical discharge. The wedding success could mean corporate contracts worth 6 figures annually, enough to ensure Tommy never had to worry about medical expenses again. Jake understood the stakes, which was why he'd supported Sarah's elaborate planning even when his startup colleagues questioned spending so much on one day. His app development company was finally gaining serious investor attention, with 3 Silicon Valley firms expressing interest in funding their next growth phase. The wedding would let those investors see Jake and Sarah as a power couple worth backing, the kind of stable partnership that reassured venture capitalists about long-term business commitments. But Sarah had no idea that Richard Blackstone was watching her pour everything into this event with growing fury. From his penthouse office overlooking the resort's main building, he'd been observing her meetings with vendors, her site visits to ceremony locations, her careful coordination of guest accommodations. Every detail she perfected was another reminder that she was choosing Jake over him, building her future with some tech entrepreneur instead of accepting the luxury lifestyle he could provide. Madison Hayes, Blackstone's new assistant who'd started 3 weeks earlier, had been reporting back on Sarah's activities with disturbing enthusiasm. The 26-year-old marketing graduate from Denver had immediately recognized the power dynamics at play and made clear she welcomed her boss's attention. Madison had access to Sarah's wedding planning files, her vendor contact lists, even her guest accommodation arrangements. What Sarah thought were private business preparations were actually being monitored and analyzed by someone who saw her as competition for Blackstone's favor. The presidential suite reservation that Sarah had made for her wedding morning preparations had been Madison's suggestion, presented as a special employee perk for such an important showcase event. The luxury suite offered private spa services, professional makeup stations, and enough space for her bridal party to prepare in comfort. Sarah had gratefully accepted what seemed like Blackstone's gesture of professional support, not realizing she was walking into a carefully prepared trap. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sarah's vendor coordination had reached fever pitch. She was managing 17 different service providers, from the florist creating custom centerpieces to the lighting technicians programming romantic ambience for the reception. Her phone rang constantly with last-minute adjustments, payment confirmations, and timeline modifications. The stress was incredible, but Sarah thrived on complex logistics. It was exactly the kind of high-pressure coordination that corporate clients would need for their own events. Jake had moved his bachelor party to the weekend before the wedding specifically so he could help Sarah with final preparations. His groomsmen, including 2 venture capitalists and a tech executive from Seattle, would arrive Thursday to see Sarah's event planning skills in action. The weekend had become an extended demonstration of what she could accomplish with luxury budgets and unlimited creative freedom. But as October 15th approached, Sarah began noticing small changes in Blackstone's behavior that made her increasingly uneasy. He'd started asking detailed questions about her wedding timeline, her bridal party arrangements, even which suite she'd be using for morning preparations. When she mentioned these concerns to Jake, he'd assured her that Blackstone was probably just interested in how the wedding would showcase his resort property. Neither of them could imagine the psychological trap that was closing around Sarah's most important day. Would Sarah's dream wedding launch her into the corporate event planning elite, or was Blackstone planning something that would destroy everything she'd worked to build? October 15th, 2025, 6:47 a.m. Sarah Mitchell woke up in the presidential suite of Blackstone Mountain Resort, feeling like she was about to conquer the world. Outside her floor-to-ceiling windows, the Colorado mountains blazed with golden autumn light, creating the perfect backdrop for what she'd planned as the most important day of her life. Her wedding dress hung pristine and beautiful on the mahogany armoire, $8,000 of Italian silk that represented months of sacrifice and planning. In 7 hours, she would walk down that mountain chapel aisle toward Jake, toward their future together, and toward the corporate clients who would witness her event planning mastery. Her bridal party had arrived at 8:30, chattering excitedly as they transformed the presidential suite into a luxury preparation salon. Emma, her maid of honor, had brought champagne and organic strawberries for the traditional bridal breakfast. Sarah's 2 bridesmaids were documenting everything on Instagram, creating the kind of behind-the-scenes content that would showcase her attention to detail to potential corporate clients. The photographer was capturing every moment. Sarah getting her hair styled into an elegant updo, the careful application of makeup that would look flawless in mountain sunlight, the laughter and tears as her grandmother fastened the pearl necklace that had been worn by 3 generations of Mitchell brides. By 10:15, Sarah looked absolutely stunning. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup glowed with professional precision, and she radiated the confidence of a woman who had planned every detail of her perfect day. The bridesmaids were getting dressed, the photographer was positioning them for photos, and Sarah was reviewing her timeline one final time when the knock came at the presidential suite door. 3 men in dark suits and earpieces stood in the hallway, looking every inch like professional security personnel. The lead man, tall and broad-shouldered, introduced himself as Agent Morrison from Resort Security. His voice was calm and authoritative as he explained there had been a credible bomb threat called in specifically targeting the wedding ceremony. They needed to evacuate Sarah immediately for her safety while the bomb squad swept the chapel and reception areas. Sarah's stomach dropped, but the explanation made sense. High-profile weddings were targets for crazy people, and Jake's growing tech company had attracted some online harassment from competitors. Agent Morrison was professional and reassuring, explaining they just needed her to come with them to a secure location while they cleared the building. Her bridal party could continue preparations, but Sarah needed to be moved immediately as the primary target. Something felt wrong as they led her through service corridors she'd never seen before, down concrete stairwells that smelled like industrial cleaning supplies. When Sarah asked why they weren't using the main elevators, Morrison explained they needed to avoid any areas where explosive devices might be planted. His partners flanked her on both sides, their hands resting near concealed weapons. The rational part of Sarah's mind knew this was standard security protocol, but her instincts were screaming warnings she couldn't quite articulate. The utility room in the resort's basement looked nothing like a secure evacuation area. Bare concrete walls, exposed pipes, a single harsh fluorescent light. When Sarah asked why they'd brought her here instead of the security office, Morrison's professional demeanor shifted into something much colder. He pulled out his phone and started recording as his partners moved to block the only door. The bomb threat had been a lie. Mr. Blackstone had very specific instructions about what needed to happen to Sarah Mitchell before she walked down that aisle. The next 20 minutes were the most terrifying of Sarah's life. They forced her into a metal chair and held her down while Morrison produced electric hair clippers. Sarah screamed and fought, but there were 3 trained men against 1 woman in a wedding dress. Morrison narrated the entire assault into his phone camera, explaining that this was what happened to employees who disrespected Richard Blackstone. They shaved off every strand of her beautiful hair while live streaming it to an anonymous account, turning her wedding day preparation into a public humiliation. But the psychological torture was worse than the physical violation. Morrison showed Sarah the live stream comments from anonymous viewers, people who had been told this was some kind of corporate discipline video. He explained that the footage would be saved permanently, ready to surface anytime she tried to build her business or reputation. If she ever tried to report what happened or retaliate against Mr. Blackstone, the video would destroy her professionally forever. The final threat broke her completely. Morrison pulled up Tommy's VA benefits file on his phone, showing Sarah how easy it would be for someone with Blackstone's connections to have her brother's disability payments suspended for suspicious activities. One phone call could destroy Tommy's medical coverage and therapy funding, leaving him desperate and without the treatment that was slowly helping him recover. If Sarah wanted to protect her brother, she would walk down that aisle, say nothing about what happened, and accept whatever story Mr. Blackstone chose to tell about her appearance. They left her alone in that concrete room for 2 hours, bald and trembling in her $8,000 dress. When Sarah finally emerged and made her way back to the chapel, the ceremony was already 3 hours behind schedule. 300 guests sat in uncomfortable silence as she walked down that aisle completely bald, her scalp shining under the mountain chapel lights. Jake's face went through shock, confusion, and what looked like horror as she approached the altar. The whispers started immediately. Nervous breakdown, wedding stress, mental illness. Sarah could see her corporate clients exchanging concerned glances, her business opportunities evaporating with every step toward the altar. Jake backed away from her, his hands shaking as he struggled to process what he was seeing. The priest looked between them uncertainly, unsure whether to proceed with a ceremony that had clearly gone terribly wrong. But how could Sarah tell 300 people, including Jake's investors and her Fortune 500 clients, that she'd been assaulted in a basement by CEO Richard Blackstone's hired men just hours before her wedding? Jake Thompson drove his Tesla back to San Francisco 3 days after the wedding that never happened, his mind still reeling from what he'd witnessed at that mountain chapel. He couldn't stop replaying the image of Sarah walking down the aisle completely bald, her scalp shining under those chapel lights while 300 guests sat in stunned silence. The woman he'd planned to marry had looked like she was in shock, moving like a sleepwalker through what should have been the happiest moment of their lives together. When Sarah had tried to explain what happened, her story made no sense. 3 security men, a bomb threat, a basement utility room. It sounded like the paranoid delusions of someone having a complete mental breakdown. Jake was a logical person, a tech entrepreneur who solved problems with data and evidence. And Sarah's explanation had no evidence. No bomb squad had swept the resort. No security reports mentioned any threats. The resort staff had no record of any evacuation protocols being activated that morning. Richard Blackstone himself had taken Jake aside at the reception that never happened, expressing deep concern for Sarah's mental health. The CEO had been genuinely sympathetic, explaining that Sarah had been under enormous pressure planning such an elaborate wedding while supporting her disabled brother's expensive medical treatments. Blackstone suggested that Sarah might need professional psychiatric help, and he'd even offered to maintain her employee health insurance during her recovery period. So Jake had left Colorado believing the woman he loved was suffering from some kind of stress-induced psychotic episode, and Sarah found herself completely alone with the truth that no one would believe. Monday morning, Sarah reported to work at Blackstone Mountain Resort, expecting to return to her luxury corner office where she'd been planning corporate events for Fortune 500 companies. Instead, she found Madison Hayes sitting behind her mahogany desk, wearing one of Sarah's client presentations on the computer screen behind her. Madison looked up with perfectly applied makeup and a smile that didn't reach her eyes as she delivered the news that would destroy what remained of Sarah's professional life. Due to Sarah's medical incident at the weekend wedding, Mr. Blackstone had decided she needed a less stressful position while she recovered from her obvious mental health crisis. Sarah was being transferred to housekeeping supervisor, effective immediately. Her corporate event planning clients had been reassigned to Madison, who demonstrated much better emotional stability and professional judgment. Sarah's company car was being repossessed, her corporate credit cards were cancelled, and her new office was a supply closet in the resort's basement laundry facility. The psychological torture was methodical and deliberate. Sarah's new duties included cleaning the presidential suite where she'd been assaulted just 4 days earlier. Every morning, she had to vacuum the carpets where she'd gotten ready for her wedding, dust the mahogany armoire where her $8,000 dress had hung, and scrub the bathroom mirror where she'd applied the makeup that was supposed to make her glow with bridal happiness. Madison made sure to schedule Sarah's cleaning duties during times when corporate clients were touring the resort. Sarah would be pushing a housekeeping cart through the elegant hallways while executives she'd once planned events for walked past without recognizing the woman who'd been their professional equal just days before. The humiliation was constant and inescapable, designed to break down whatever dignity and self-respect Sarah had left. But the worst part was watching Tommy deteriorate without his private therapy sessions. Dr. Martinez's specialized PTSD treatment cost $2,400 monthly, money that Sarah's new housekeeping supervisor salary couldn't possibly cover. Tommy's VA benefits provided basic counseling, but not the intensive cognitive behavioral therapy that had been slowly pulling him back from the severe depression that consumed him after his medical discharge from the Marines. Within 2 weeks of Sarah's demotion, Tommy stopped leaving his apartment. He'd sit in his wheelchair staring at the wall for hours, lost in flashbacks to the IED explosion that had shattered his life in Afghanistan. Sarah would come home from 8-hour shifts cleaning luxury suites to find her brother crying about the Marines he couldn't save, the legs he'd lost, the future that had been destroyed by someone else's war. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in early November when Sarah found Tommy holding one of his prescription pain medications, staring at the bottle with hollow, defeated eyes. He looked up at her and said he couldn't be her burden anymore. Sarah was working as a janitor because of him, her wedding had been destroyed because of his medical expenses, and everyone would be better off if he just gave up completely and stopped fighting to recover. Sarah realized that Blackstone's psychological torture wasn't just destroying her. It was crushing the brother she'd sacrificed everything to protect. She was trapped in a job she couldn't quit because Tommy needed the health insurance, working in the same building where she'd been assaulted, cleaning the same rooms where her dreams had died, while watching her brother lose all hope and withdraw from the world because he blamed himself for her downfall. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't quit her housekeeping job, but she could use her access to areas of the resort that regular employees never saw. As a supervisor, she had master keys to executive offices, boardrooms, and private suites. If Blackstone wanted to destroy her life systematically, she would find a way to fight back with the only weapons she had left: determination, desperation, and access to places where powerful men thought their secrets were safe. But Sarah had no idea that her lowest moment was about to become her greatest opportunity, and that Blackstone's own criminal activities would provide the evidence she needed to bring down the man who destroyed everything she'd worked to build. Sarah's breaking point came on a freezing December morning when she found herself scrubbing the same marble bathroom counter in Blackstone's penthouse office for the third time that week. The luxury executive suite overlooked the entire Colorado Mountain Valley, a reminder of the power gap between the billionaire CEO who destroyed her life and the woman now cleaning his toilets for minimum wage. But what Sarah didn't realize was that her rock-bottom moment was about to become her greatest opportunity for justice. As housekeeping supervisor, Sarah had master key access to every room in the resort, including executive areas that regular employees never entered. Blackstone's penthouse office was cleaned weekly, usually when he was traveling to inspect his other resort properties. Sarah had been avoiding this particular assignment, but Madison Hayes had specifically scheduled her for Blackstone's office cleaning, probably hoping the psychological torture of touching his personal belongings would finally break Sarah completely. The penthouse office was a monument to ego and wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a mahogany desk that cost more than most people's cars, leather furniture imported from Italy, and walls covered with framed magazine covers featuring Blackstone's face. But it was the computer setup that caught Sarah's attention. Multiple high-end monitors displaying what looked like financial trading platforms, numbers scrolling constantly, even though Blackstone was supposed to be in meetings downstairs. Sarah knew she shouldn't look, but curiosity overcame caution as she dusted around the computer setup. The screens showed cryptocurrency trading platforms she'd never seen before, with transactions involving millions of dollars. One monitor displayed what appeared to be gambling websites, not the regulated casino apps that were legal in Colorado, but underground crypto betting platforms with names like Darkcoin Poker and BitGamble Elite. The numbers were staggering. Blackstone was losing hundreds of thousands of dollars daily on cryptocurrency gambling, with total losses reaching into the tens of millions. But it was the third monitor that made Sarah's blood run cold. The screen showed what appeared to be employee retirement accounts for Blackstone Resort employees, 401k funds, pension contributions, and investment portfolios that belonged to hundreds of workers throughout the company. Sarah recognized names on the list: Maria from housekeeping, David from maintenance, Jennifer from guest services. These were real people whose retirement savings were displayed on Blackstone's private gambling setup. Sarah quickly realized what she was looking at. Blackstone was stealing money from employee retirement accounts to fund his cryptocurrency gambling addiction. The resort chain employed over 2,000 people across 12 states, and their retirement contributions were supposed to be safely invested in legitimate financial instruments. Instead, Blackstone was siphoning millions of dollars from worker pensions to cover his gambling debts to underground crypto syndicates. The evidence was right there on the computer screens, but Sarah knew she needed help understanding the full scope of the fraud. She used her phone to take photos of the screens, careful not to touch anything that might leave fingerprints or trigger security alerts. The financial data was complex: spreadsheets showing transfers between accounts, cryptocurrency wallet addresses, and what looked like communication logs with offshore gambling platforms. 2 days later, while cleaning the resort's main conference room, Sarah encountered Emma Davis for the first time. The 35-year-old financial auditor was conducting her quarterly review of the resort's books, something that happened every few months as part of the resort chain's corporate compliance requirements. Emma had been working late, surrounded by financial documents and looking increasingly frustrated with what she was discovering. Sarah almost walked past without saying anything, but something about Emma's expression made her stop. The auditor looked like someone who'd found problems but didn't know how serious they were or what to do about them. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change both their lives. She approached Emma and quietly asked if she'd noticed anything unusual about the employee retirement fund management. Emma's reaction told Sarah everything she needed to know. The auditor had indeed noticed irregularities, large transfers from employee 401k accounts that didn't match standard investment protocols, cryptocurrency transactions that made no sense for a hospitality company, and gaps in documentation that suggested systematic manipulation of retirement funds. But Emma had been hesitating to report her findings because accusing a billionaire CEO of embezzlement was career destruction without ironclad proof. Sarah showed Emma the photos from Blackstone's office, and the auditor's face went pale as she recognized the same account numbers and cryptocurrency addresses that had been troubling her for weeks. Emma explained that Blackstone appeared to owe approximately $60 million to underground cryptocurrency gambling syndicates, debts he was paying with money stolen from employee retirement accounts. The fraud affected over 1,500 workers across the resort chain, people who had no idea their pension contributions were funding their boss's gambling addiction. But Emma had discovered something even more disturbing. The cryptocurrency gambling platforms Blackstone was using were connected to money laundering operations that the FBI had been investigating for months. By stealing employee retirement funds to pay gambling debts, Blackstone was actually laundering money for international criminal organizations. This wasn't just corporate embezzlement. It was organized crime that could result in decades of federal prison time. Sarah realized this was bigger than personal revenge. 1,500 families were depending on retirement money that Blackstone had stolen to feed his gambling addiction. Maria from housekeeping, who was 58 and planning to retire in 4 years. David from maintenance, who had 3 kids and was counting on his 401k to pay for their college educations. Jennifer from guest services, whose husband had cancer and whose retirement fund was their only financial security. Emma explained that as a licensed financial auditor, she was legally required to report suspected fraud to federal authorities, but she needed more evidence to build a case that would actually result in prosecution. Corporate executives had expensive lawyers and political connections that could make fraud charges disappear unless the evidence was overwhelming. They needed documentation of the gambling activities, proof of the retirement fund theft, and ideally recorded confessions that would eliminate any possibility of Blackstone claiming ignorance. Working together, Sarah and Emma developed a systematic plan to gather evidence. Sarah's housekeeping access gave her opportunities to photograph financial documents and computer screens during Blackstone's travels. Emma's auditing authority allowed her to request specific financial records that would document the pattern of theft. They coordinated their efforts carefully, communicating through encrypted messaging apps and meeting in locations where resort security cameras couldn't record their conversations. The investigation revealed the full scope of Blackstone's criminal empire. He'd been stealing from employee retirement accounts for over 2 years, initially taking small amounts to cover minor gambling losses, then escalating to millions of dollars monthly as his addiction spiraled out of control. The underground cryptocurrency gambling platforms were operated by international crime syndicates that charged enormous interest on unpaid debts. Blackstone was trapped in a cycle where he had to steal more money each month just to avoid being eliminated by criminal enforcers. But Sarah and Emma also discovered Blackstone's vulnerability. The cryptocurrency gambling platforms kept detailed records of all transactions, including recorded video calls where Blackstone discussed his theft of employee retirement funds. The criminal organizations recorded everything as insurance against clients who might try to escape their debts. If Sarah and Emma could access those recordings, they would have Blackstone confessing to federal crimes in his own words. Emma explained that successful whistleblower cases could result in financial rewards of up to 30% of recovered funds. With $60 million stolen from employee retirement accounts, a successful prosecution could mean whistleblower payments exceeding $15 million. But more importantly, prosecution would return stolen money to the 1,500 families whose retirement security had been destroyed by Blackstone's criminal greed. Sarah realized that her personal destruction had accidentally positioned her to save hundreds of families from financial ruin. Her access to Blackstone's private areas, combined with Emma's financial expertise and legal authority, created an opportunity to bring down a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond one vindictive CEO's personal vendetta. The question now was whether they could gather enough evidence to ensure Blackstone's prosecution before he discovered their investigation and used his wealth and connections to escape justice forever. The final phase unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated corporate takedown, with Sarah and Emma moving their pieces into position while Blackstone remained oblivious to the investigation closing around him. 3 months after discovering the cryptocurrency fraud, they had assembled an ironclad case that would destroy the man who'd thought himself untouchable. Jake's return to Colorado in late February came as a shock to Sarah, who'd assumed he'd moved on permanently after their wedding disaster. But guilt had eaten away at him for months. Something about Sarah's story had never felt right, and his tech entrepreneur instincts finally convinced him to investigate what had really happened that October morning. When Sarah finally revealed the truth about Blackstone's assault and showed Jake the evidence of the cryptocurrency fraud, his horror turned to rage that matched her own. Jake's tech expertise proved invaluable in documenting Blackstone's digital crimes, using blockchain analysis tools to trace the stolen retirement funds through underground gambling platforms. The breakthrough came when Emma discovered that Blackstone's cryptocurrency gambling platforms recorded video calls with high-stakes clients as insurance against defaults. Using her auditing authority, Emma requested access to Blackstone's corporate communication records, uncovering hours of recorded conversations where he openly discussed stealing employee retirement funds to pay gambling debts. Sarah, Emma, and Jake coordinated with FBI financial crimes investigators, providing evidence of securities fraud affecting over 1,500 employees across the resort chain. The case qualified for maximum whistleblower protections under the Dodd-Frank Act, ensuring Sarah couldn't face retaliation for reporting the crimes. The climactic moment came during Blackstone's annual shareholder meeting in March 2026. As he addressed 400 investors and employees about the company's record profits, FBI agents walked onto the stage with arrest warrants for securities fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. The live CNBC broadcast captured Blackstone's face as he realized his criminal empire was collapsing in front of the financial world. Sarah stood in the back of that ballroom, her hair grown back beautifully, watching the man who destroyed her wedding day being led away in handcuffs. The $60 million in stolen retirement funds was recovered and returned to employee accounts, while Sarah received a $12.4 million whistleblower reward, enough to secure Tommy's medical treatment permanently and launch her own luxury event planning company. Jake proposed again that evening at the same mountain chapel where their first wedding had been destroyed, and this time Sarah said yes with tears of joy instead of trauma. Blackstone received 28 years in federal prison, while Sarah's new company thrived with Emma as her CFO and Jake as her technology partner. The presidential suite where Sarah had been assaulted became her corporate headquarters, transforming the site of her greatest trauma into the foundation of her ultimate triumph. Justice had been served, families were protected, and Sarah Mitchell had proven that even billionaire predators weren't above the law when brave people decided to fight back.